Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might quietly rearrange the way you think about beauty, about resistance, and about what happens when a people who've been told for 300 years that they have nothing worth saying finally get a room of their own and start talking. We're stepping into a neighborhood. 3 square miles of upper Manhattan, give or take a few alleyways and one very ambitious barbershop. And for a brief, blazing stretch of the 1920s and early 1930s, something happened there that had never happened before in the history of the Americas. Black people didn't just survive, they created, they composed, they argued over philosophy at kitchen tables still warm from collard greens. They danced until the floorboards buckled and the neighbors either called the police or came down to join in. They wrote poems that grabbed the English language by the collar and said, "Sit down, you've been telling the wrong story." Tonight, we're talking about the Harlem Renaissance and why it was so revolutionary for the soul. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Tell me this too. Have you ever encountered a piece of art, a song, a line of poetry, a painting, anything that hit you so hard it changed the way you saw yourself? Not just the way you saw the world, but the way you understood your own place in it. Because that's really what tonight is about. That's the whole thing. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Settle in. Pour yourself something warm, or something strong, or both. The people we're visiting tonight would have probably offered you bootleg gin poured from a teapot and a plate of someone's grandmother's fried chicken. And they would have done it while reciting County Cullen and debating whether jazz was sacred or profane. We'll make do with what we've got. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to arrive in Harlem in, say, 1925? To step off a train at Penn Station with a cardboard suitcase and red Georgia clay still under your fingernails, lungs heavy with the memory of cotton dust, and find yourself suddenly surrounded by more black faces than you'd ever seen in your entire life. All of them moving with a freedom you didn't know was legal. What did it smell like on Lenox Avenue in the evening, when the barbecue joints were sending smoke signals across 3 blocks, and the speakeasies were just beginning to hum behind unmarked doors? What happened when a young woman from a sharecropping family in the Mississippi Delta walked into a rent party on a Saturday night and heard stride piano for the first time, fast and proud and unapologetic, and realized that sound was the sound of people who refused to be ashamed? What was it like to pick up a copy of a magazine called The Crisis and see your own experience reflected back at you in language that didn't apologize, didn't shrink, didn't beg for permission to exist? Could you really hear Duke Ellington on a weeknight? Did people actually dance until 4 in the morning on a Tuesday? And what happens to a people's soul when, after centuries of being told they are less than human, they look around a crowded room and see genius, beauty, defiance, and joy staring back at them from every direction? Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1926, somewhere in the heart of Harlem, New York City. The sheets beneath you are thin and faintly damp. The radiator in the corner is clanking and hissing like it's trying to communicate something urgent in a language only plumbing understands. And somewhere below your window, maybe 1 floor down, maybe 2, maybe out on the fire escape, where someone has dragged a chair, a saxophone is working its way through a melody that doesn't have a name yet, because jazz doesn't wait for permission. It just shows up. You sit up in a narrow bed inside a railroad flat, one of those long, skinny apartments that stretches back from the street like a hallway with ambitions it can't quite afford. The walls are papered in something floral that was probably cheerful 20 years ago, before the landlord decided that maintenance was a philosophical concept rather than a practical obligation. The crack running across the ceiling is shaped vaguely like the Mississippi River, which feels like a cosmic joke, or maybe a cosmic map, considering how many people in this building left Mississippi to get here. The air smells like coffee, strong and slightly burnt, and beneath that, someone is frying something in lard 2 floors down. Pork, maybe, or fish, and the scent mixes with coal smoke from the building's furnace and the sharp bite of cold morning air leaking through a window that doesn't quite seal. You can hear footsteps above you, a child laughing somewhere deeper in the building, the distant metallic clatter of the elevated train on its tracks. Harlem is already awake. Harlem was probably never fully asleep. Here's the thing about this neighborhood that nobody prepares you for. Not the newspapers, not the letters from your cousin who moved up here 2 years ago, not even the pamphlets the labor recruiters handed out down south. 3 square miles, that's all it is. 3 square miles of Upper Manhattan, bounded roughly by 110th Street to the south and 155th to the north, river to river if you're being generous. And by the mid-1920s, nearly 175,000 black people are packed into this space. Some estimates push it higher. The population density in certain blocks exceeds anything else in Manhattan, which is saying something, because Manhattan is already the most densely populated island in the Western Hemisphere. Families of 5 and 6 live in apartments designed for 2. Lodgers sleep in shifts. Hallways become bedrooms. Kitchens become gathering places, churches, and stages. The rent is brutal, roughly $40 to $100 a month for apartments that white tenants in other neighborhoods rent for 30% less. And the wages are modest, $2 to $5 a day if you're lucky enough to find steady work. But here's the catch, and this is where everything gets interesting. Despite the crowding, despite the exploitation, despite the fact that white landlords are bleeding this community for every nickel while providing as little maintenance as legally possible, and sometimes less, something extraordinary is happening here. Something that has never happened before in American history. A critical mass of black artists, writers, musicians, thinkers, preachers, philosophers, comedians, dressmakers, cooks, barbers, and ordinary people who happen to be living in the right place at the right time are colliding in these few blocks, and the collision is producing an explosion of culture so powerful it will reshape the entire Western world's understanding of what black people are capable of. Which, if you think about it, is a wild sentence to type in 2026, because the answer to what black people are capable of should have been obvious from the beginning. But America had spent 3 centuries building an elaborate mythology to avoid admitting that, and Harlem was where the mythology started to crack. Let's talk about how you got here, because you didn't just wake up in Harlem by accident. Nobody does. You came from somewhere, and the somewhere matters. Maybe you came from Georgia, maybe Alabama, maybe the swampy bottomlands of the Mississippi Delta, where your family had been sharecropping since Reconstruction, which is a polite way of saying your family had been trapped in a system designed to replicate slavery's economics without slavery's name. You picked cotton until your fingers bled, turned over most of the harvest to a white landowner who kept the books in a way that always somehow left you owing more than you earned, and you went to bed hungry in a shack with gaps in the walls wide enough to watch the stars through. And maybe one morning you woke up and decided you were finished. Maybe it was the boll weevil that ate the crop. Maybe it was the lynching 2 counties over that everyone whispered about but nobody reported. Maybe it was the letter from your cousin up in New York, the one that said, "Come on, there's work here, there's music, there's a life up here that doesn't require you to step off the sidewalk every time a white person walks toward you, doesn't require you to say sir and ma'am to people half your age just because their skin is lighter than yours." Whatever the reason, you got on a train. The Illinois Central, maybe, or the Seaboard Airline, and you rode north with everything you owned in a single bag. The Great Migration. That's what they'll call it later, when historians get around to naming it. Between roughly 1910 and 1940, over 1.5 million black people leave the South and head for northern cities, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and New York, specifically Harlem. They come from everywhere. Cotton farmers from Alabama, tobacco workers from the Carolinas, sugarcane cutters from Louisiana, domestic workers from Virginia. They bring their recipes, their church songs, their work ethic, their stories, their grief, their stubborn, unshakable belief that somewhere, surely, life has to be better than this. And they pour into Harlem like water filling a vessel that wasn't quite built to hold them. And the vessel doesn't break. It transforms. You step off the train, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of the city. It's the sound, the clang of streetcars, the honking of automobile horns, still novel enough to be thrilling. The sheer volume of human voices, hundreds of conversations overlapping, laughter cutting through traffic noise, a newsboy shouting headlines on the corner of 125th and Lenox. And then, underneath all of it, like a heartbeat, music, always music, drifting out of an open window, leaking from the back door of a club, hummed by a woman hanging laundry on a rooftop line. Harlem breathes music the way other neighborhoods breathe exhaust. You walk north from 125th Street, and the transformation is immediate. Black faces everywhere. Black-owned businesses lining the avenues. A barbershop with 3 chairs and 4 opinions. A beauty parlor advertising the latest techniques from Madam C.J. Walker's company. The hair care empire built by a black woman who became the first self-made female millionaire in America. A funeral home with polished windows. A dentist's office above a grocery store. A church, then another church, then a storefront church, squeezed between a tailor and a shoe repair shop. In 1926, a researcher named Ira Reed surveys 150 blocks in Harlem and counts 140 churches. 2/3 of them operate out of storefronts, living rooms, and the back rooms of flats. Some of them are here today and gone tomorrow, as James Weldon Johnson puts it. But the ones that last become the pillars of the community. Abyssinian Baptist Church, where Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr. preaches to a congregation so large they need a new building on 138th Street. Mother African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the oldest black church in New York, which has been running since 1796, since before the city even had gas lamps, serving as an underground railroad stop, and now, in the 1920s, as one of the cultural anchors of the Renaissance. Fats Waller, the jazz pianist, with hands big enough to reach a 12th on the keyboard, plays the organ at Abyssinian because his father is a minister there, and the sacred and the secular coexist in Harlem the way they've always coexisted in black life. Not as contradictions, but as 2 sides of the same coin, 2 ways of saying the same thing, which is, we are here, and we will not be silenced. Sunday morning in Harlem is its own event. You hear it before you see it. The singing carries for blocks, spirituals that traveled from West Africa to the rice plantations of South Carolina, to the cotton fields of Alabama, to a brownstone church on 7th Avenue, the melody unbroken across centuries, and an ocean reshaped by every generation that carried it but never diminished. Women in their best hats and white gloves, men in suits pressed sharp enough to cut bread, children scrubbed and braided and warned with a look that needs no words to behave themselves in the house of the Lord. The choir doesn't just sing, the choir testifies. The sopranos hit notes that seem to come from somewhere deeper than the throat, somewhere in the marrow, somewhere in the collective memory of a people who've been singing through suffering since before anyone thought to write it down. And the congregation responds, not passively, not politely, but with their whole bodies, swaying and clapping and shouting Amen. And yes, Lord, and tell it, because worship in a black church has never been a spectator sport. It's a conversation between the human and the divine, and everybody in the room has something to say. After church, the avenue comes alive in a different way. Families strolling in their Sunday best, the smell of roasting chicken and baking cornbread drifting from apartment windows, men gathering on corners to argue about Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican-born activist whose Universal Negro Improvement Association has set up its headquarters right here in Harlem on 135th Street, and whose message of black pride, economic independence, and a return to Africa is either the most important idea of the century or the most dangerous, depending on who you ask. The debates are passionate and loud and not always polite, and that's fine, because Harlem in the 1920s is not a neighborhood that values politeness over truth. Soapbox speakers draw crowds on 7th and Lenox Avenues, some offering political oratory, some selling medicine, some doing both at the same time. The intellectual energy on these sidewalks is extraordinary. A marketplace of ideas operating in the open air, free of charge, open to anyone willing to stand and listen. But the Renaissance isn't just happening on the streets and in the churches. It's happening in the apartments, the railroad flats and the cramped tenements and the brownstones on what they're starting to call Strivers Row, that elegant stretch of 138th and 139th Streets between 7th and 8th Avenues, where the houses were designed by Stanford White and where black doctors and lawyers and musicians live in homes so beautiful, the neighbors just shake their heads and call it aspirational. The Renaissance is happening in kitchens where someone's grandmother is frying fish and someone's nephew is reading a poem he just wrote, and someone's neighbor from down the hall has brought a jug of something that definitely isn't grape juice. It's happening at kitchen tables where people who pick up other people's laundry for a living are discussing whether Langston Hughes or County Cullen is the better poet. And they have opinions, strong ones, because art in Harlem isn't something that belongs to the elite. It belongs to everyone. That's the whole point. That's what makes it revolutionary. Let's talk about the rent party, because if there's a single institution that captures the soul of the Harlem Renaissance better than anything else, it might be this one. You need to understand the economics first. Black tenants in 1920s, Harlem are paying roughly 30% more for their apartments than the white working-class New Yorkers pay for comparable spaces in other neighborhoods. Wages are low, jobs are scarce and often seasonal. The first of the month arrives with the regularity of a natural disaster, and the rent is due, and the landlord does not care about your circumstances. So people improvise, they adapt, they throw a party. Here's how it works. You print up a little card, maybe a flyer, with a clever rhyming couplet at the top and the details at the bottom. The invitations are works of folk art in their own right. Langston Hughes saves dozens of them, stores them in a red box that once held his checkbooks, and carries them with him through years of travel to the Soviet Union, to Haiti, to Japan. because he understands that these little scraps of paper are history. The cards advertise what's officially called a social whist party, though some hosts get creative. A midsummer frolic, a beer brawl, a chitterling strut. The format is simple. You open your apartment on a Saturday night. You charge admission, maybe a quarter, maybe 50 cents. You serve food, usually something hearty and cheap and delicious. Fried chicken, pig's feet, collard greens, cornbread, rice and beans. Food that travelled north in the memory and the muscles of southern hands. You hire a pianist, or if you can't afford a pianist, you put on records, and you roll back whatever furniture will move, and you dance. The pianist, if you've got one, is everything. Stride piano, that thundering, joyful, technically astonishing style that sounds like two people playing at once. Left hand jumping octaves like a heartbeat gone wild. Right hand spinning melodies that nobody wrote down because the whole point is that you're making them up as you go. James P. Johnson, Willie the Lion Smith, Fats Waller, still a teenager, already playing with a touch so powerful and so tender it makes grown people weep. The music starts around 10 and doesn't stop until 3, 4, sometimes 5 in the morning. The apartment fills with bodies, with heat, with the smell of sweat and perfume and cigarette smoke and whatever's frying in the kitchen. People dance in the hallway. People dance on the stairs. Someone always ends up dancing on a table, and the table always survives, which is a testament to both Depression-era furniture, construction, and the supernatural durability of objects that know they're part of history. The floorboards flex under the weight of all that joy, and the neighbors either complain or they come down and pay their quarter and join in. Because the sound is irresistible. Because the sound is the sound of people choosing happiness in the middle of an economic system designed to crush them. And here's the thing about rent parties that the history books don't always emphasize enough. Yes, they were born out of necessity. Yes, they were a response to exploitation and poverty and the relentless squeeze of racist economics. But they were also gorgeous. They were acts of communal creativity and mutual aid. You threw a party because you needed rent money, and your neighbors came because they needed to dance, and the musician came because they needed to play, and somewhere in the overlap of all those needs, something was created that was greater than the sum of its parts. Culture doesn't always come from galleries and concert halls and publishing houses. Sometimes it comes from a railroad flat on a Saturday night, where somebody's grandmother is collecting quarters at the door, and a 20-year-old piano player is inventing the future of American music between the kitchen and the coal stove. Now let's step outside. Let's walk down Lenox Avenue on a weeknight in 1926 and pay attention to what's happening on either side of the street. The barbershops are still open. They're always open, it seems, because a barbershop in Harlem is not just a place where you get your hair cut. It's a parliament, a debating society, a gossip exchange, a therapy session, and occasionally, if the barber is feeling ambitious, a place where you can place a small bet on the numbers game, which is Harlem's unofficial lottery and one of the community's most reliable shadow economies. The barber knows everything. The barber has read more newspapers this week than most college professors. The barber has opinions about everything, from Marcus Garvey to prize fighting, to the quality of this morning's biscuits at the lunch counter down the block. The barber will cut your hair and your ego with equal precision, and you'll tip him for both. Next door, or maybe across the street, there's a beauty parlor where women sit under dryers that look like inverted fish bowls, talking about their men, their jobs, their children, their landlords, and whether Zora Neale Hurston is as talented as she thinks she is, which, for the record, she absolutely is. But that doesn't stop people from having opinions. The beauty parlor is another parliament. Harlem has a lot of parliaments. Democracy in this neighborhood doesn't wait for election day. It happens every time two people with strong convictions and a shared bottle of something find themselves in the same room. Down the block, you pass a newsstand stacked with papers. The New York Amsterdam News, one of Harlem's two major black newspapers, runs the social pages that chronicle the meetings, dinners, and dances of hundreds of small clubs and organizations. The New York Age covers the political scene, but the publications that are really shaking the foundations are the magazines. The Crisis, edited by W.E.B. Du Bois and published by the NAACP, which has been running since 1910, and whose circulation peaks at around 100,000 copies. Opportunity, published by the National Urban League and edited by Charles S. Johnson, who is as responsible as anyone alive for creating the conditions in which the Harlem Renaissance flourishes. The Survey Graphic, which devotes an entire issue in March 1925 to Harlem, under the guest editorship of Alain Locke, the Howard University professor and first Black Rhodes Scholar, who is quietly, methodically, brilliantly building the intellectual framework for the entire movement. Locke edits that issue into a book called The New Negro, published later that year, and the book becomes a kind of manifesto. It declares, in effect, we are not the people you think we are. We are not the shuffling, grateful, diminished figures of the minstrel stage and the plantation novel. We are artists. We are thinkers. We are the new Negro. And we are defining ourselves on our own terms, in our own language, for the first time. You want to understand why the Renaissance was revolutionary for the soul? Start there. Start with the act of self-definition. For 300 years, black people in America had been defined by others, defined as property, defined as 3/5 of a person, defined as inferior, childlike, dangerous, subhuman, invisible, or some shifting combination of all of these, depending on what the definer needed at the moment. The entire machinery of American culture, its literature, its laws, its science, its religion, its popular entertainment, had been devoted to constructing a version of blackness that served white supremacy. Minstrel shows, pseudo-scientific racism, the happy slave narrative, the dangerous black brute narrative, Jim Crow laws that didn't just segregate bodies, but segregated the imagination, insisting that black life was simple, primitive, and unworthy of serious artistic attention. And then Harlem said no. Not loudly, not with a single declaration, but with 1,000 acts of creation that said, collectively, relentlessly, beautifully, this is who we actually are. Look at us. Listen to us. We have been here all along, and we have things to say that will change everything. Let's talk about the writers, because the writers are the ones who put language to the feeling. Langston Hughes arrives in Harlem in the early 1920s. He's young, he's broke, he's carrying a battered suitcase and a notebook full of poems, and he's the most important poet of the 20th century, though nobody knows that yet, least of all him. Hughes writes about Harlem the way nobody has ever written about a black neighborhood before. Not as a sociological problem, not as a picturesque setting for white characters' adventures, but as a living, breathing, singing, suffering, laughing, sweating, dancing community of real human beings whose daily experiences are worthy of the highest art. He writes about the elevator operator and the shoeshine boy, and the woman scrubbing floors in a downtown office building, and the old man sitting on a stoop watching the world go by. He writes in a language that sounds like the people it describes, vernacular and musical and direct. He uses the rhythms of jazz and blues as the scaffolding for his verse, and the result is poetry that feels like something you'd overhear on a street corner, except that it stops your heart. Consider what that means. In an America where the dominant literary culture assumes that poetry is about English gardens and Greek myths, and the refined sensibilities of educated white people, Hughes walks in and says, "Actually, poetry is about a piano player in a Harlem bar who plays the blues so deep, the whole room goes quiet. Poetry is about a mother telling her son that life ain't been no crystal staircase. Poetry is about what it feels like to be black and tired and beautiful and invisible all at the same time. And if you don't think that's poetry, maybe you've been reading the wrong poems." He publishes his first collection, The Weary Blues, in 1926, and it lands like a depth charge in American letters. The title poem describes a pianist in Harlem playing late into the night, rocking back and forth, and the sound of that piano becomes the sound of a people's pain and persistence, and Hughes makes you hear it even on the page. He's not alone. County Cullen writes with a formal elegance that owes more to Keats and Shelley than to the blues, and the tension between that European form and his specifically black American content creates something electric. A poet who proves that mastery of the Western canon and deep engagement with black life are not contradictions, but complementary strengths. Claude McKay, born in Jamaica, writes with a fury and a fire that shakes the ground. His sonnet, If We Must Die, written in the wake of the Red Summer of 1919, when racial violence swept across America, is a declaration of defiance so powerful that Winston Churchill will quote it decades later during World War II, without ever mentioning that its author was a black man from the Caribbean writing about white mob violence. And then there's Zora Neale Hurston. She arrives in Harlem from Florida with a razor wit, a trained anthropologist's eye, and absolutely no interest in performing respectability for white audiences. Where some Renaissance writers feel the pressure to present only the most polished, most dignified version of black life, Hurston dives headfirst into the folk traditions, the rural speech, the tall tales, the juke joints, the voodoo, the entire rich, complex, sometimes messy reality of black Southern culture. She collects folklore with the rigor of a scientist and the passion of a woman who loves her people exactly as they are, not as someone else thinks they should be. She'll write Their Eyes Were Watching God later in 1937, a novel so luminous and so ahead of its time that it will take decades for the literary world to catch up. In the 1920s, though, she's at the center of the Harlem scene, hosting gatherings, telling stories that make rooms full of intellectuals laugh until they cry, collaborating with Hughes on a magazine called Fire. That's meant to burn up old ideas about what black art should be. And she's magnificent. She's also controversial, because she refuses to write propaganda, refuses to make her art serve anyone's political agenda, insists that black people are complicated human beings rather than symbols, and some of her fellow Renaissance artists find this maddening. The debates about art and politics, about whether black art should uplift the race or simply tell the truth, about who gets to decide what a authentic black expression looks like. These debates rage through Harlem like a productive fire, burning away assumptions and clearing ground for something new. Let's shift the hour. It's evening now, and Harlem's nightlife is waking up. You hear it gradually at first, like the city is tuning an instrument. A trumpet warming up in a back room, the clatter of ice in a bucket, laughter spilling from an open window. Then, all at once, the night arrives in full voice, and you step outside into a different Harlem, the one the tourists from downtown are starting to discover. the one that will become legendary. Start with the music, because in Harlem, in the 1920s, the music is everywhere. It's inescapable, and it's changing the world. Jazz. That word, which might come from a slang term for energy or excitement, or something more suggestive, depending on who you ask, that word is becoming the name for the sound of the 20th century. And Harlem is where it's reaching its fullest expression, at least on the East Coast, at least in these years, at least in the clubs and dance halls and rent parties and street corners where musicians are pushing the boundaries of what's possible with melody, rhythm, improvisation, and sheer audacity. Duke Ellington is at the Cotton Club. Let's start there, because you can't tell this story without the Cotton Club. Even though the Cotton Club is one of the most infuriating contradictions in the entire Renaissance. Located on 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue, owned by a white gangster named Oni Madden, who's using it partly as a front for his bootleg beer operation. The Cotton Club seats about 700 people and presents black performers exclusively to white audiences. You read that right. The most famous nightclub in Harlem, the one that broadcasts nationally over the radio, the one that introduces America to Duke Ellington's orchestra, is a whites-only establishment in the middle of a black neighborhood. The decor is designed to evoke a plantation, fantasy, tropical and exotic, and deeply, insidiously racist in its framing. Black performers, among the most talented musicians on earth, play to rooms full of white patrons who've come uptown for a taste of the exotic, who want to consume black culture without actually having to treat black people as equals. And yet Duke Ellington is there. And what Duke Ellington does with that stage is nothing short of alchemy. His orchestra, a group of musicians so skilled they make the impossible sound effortless, performs original compositions that elevate jazz from dance music to serious art. The radio broadcasts reach millions. Ellington's sophisticated arrangements, his use of individual musicians' voices as compositional colors, his willingness to draw from the blues and the spiritual and the concert hall all at once, all of this is changing what America thinks music can be. His musicians earn $50 to $75 a week, in an era when most musicians make $15 to $30, and they live in Harlem's better buildings, and they carry themselves with a dignity and a confidence that contradicts every stereotype the Cotton Club's decor is trying to reinforce. So the contradiction sits there, unresolved, and it sits at the heart of the entire Renaissance. Black genius, performing inside a system that exploits and demeans it, and somehow transcending that system through the sheer power of the work itself. The music doesn't care about the club's seating policy. The music is bigger than the room. If the Cotton Club represents the painful paradox of black art in white spaces, the Savoy Ballroom represents something closer to what the community actually wants. The Savoy, which opens in 1926 on Lenox Avenue between 141st and 141st Streets, is a different animal entirely. It spans an entire city block. It has a polished maple dance floor that can hold 4,000 people. It's integrated by choice, not by law, meaning anyone can come in regardless of race, and the result is one of the most extraordinary social spaces in American history. The Savoy features 2 bandstands, one at each end of the hall, and the bands take turns playing so the music never stops. This arrangement produces the famous Battle of the Bands, where orchestras led by Chick Webb, Cab Calloway, Fletcher Henderson, and others go head-to-head in musical combat, each group pushing the other to play harder, faster, more inventively, while the crowd roars and dances and decides the winner by the sheer volume of their joy. The Lindy Hop is born here, or at least it reaches its fullest expression here. Named for Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic in 1927, the Lindy is a couple's dance that combines African-American rhythms with European partner dance forms, and it's athletic, improvisational, joyful, and contagious. Dancers at the Savoy develop moves that look like they're defying gravity, flipping and spinning and throwing their partners through the air, with a combination of strength and trust that makes the whole thing look like organized chaos, which is basically what it is. Shorty George Snowden, one of the dancers credited with naming the Lindy, does things on the dance floor that make professional athletes look stiff. The Savoy produces its own culture, its own celebrities, its own hierarchy based on nothing but skill and creativity, and the willingness to get out on that floor and move. When you dance at the Savoy, nobody cares what color you are, how much money you make, or where you came from. They care about whether you can keep up. And that, in 1920s America, is revolutionary. But the music doesn't stop at the big clubs. It's in the speakeasies that line 133rd Street, the block known as the Jungle, where you can find everything from a smoky basement bar to an elegant cabaret within a single block. Gladys Bentley performs at the Clam House, a woman so audacious and so talented that she becomes one of Harlem's biggest draws. She wears a white tuxedo, she plays piano, she sings raunchy songs, and she does all of this as an openly masculine presenting woman in 1920s America, which takes a kind of courage that most people can't even imagine. Harlem's nightlife has a queer dimension that the official histories often downplay, but it's there, it's vibrant, and it's part of what makes the Renaissance what it is. The drag balls, the speakeasies that welcome all kinds, the artistic community's relatively open acceptance of sexual and gender diversity, all of this exists alongside the churches and the family dinners and the respectable cultural events. And the fact that these seemingly contradictory worlds can coexist in the same 3 square miles is itself a testament to the neighborhood's complexity and humanity. Louis Armstrong comes through Harlem and changes everything he touches. His trumpet playing isn't just technically brilliant, it's emotionally devastating. He takes jazz improvisation to a place nobody knew it could go, turning the solo from a decorative flourish into the emotional center of the music. When Armstrong plays, the room reorganizes itself around his sound. Even other musicians, people who've been playing their whole lives, stand there with their mouths open. The man makes brass sing, he makes brass laugh, he makes brass cry, and he does it with a joy and a generosity that makes everyone in the room feel like they're part of the creation. Fletcher Henderson's orchestra, based at the Roseland Ballroom downtown, but deeply connected to the Harlem scene, showcases some of the most sophisticated arranging in jazz history. Cab Calloway brings a showmanship to the Cotton Club that makes every performance an event. His zoot suits and his scat singing, and his call and response routines with the audience turning the nightclub into a collective experience rather than a passive one. Chick Webb, the tiny hunchback drummer who leads the house band at the Savoy, plays with a power and a precision that seem to come from somewhere outside his body, and he discovers a young singer named Ella Fitzgerald, and together they make music that will outlast both of them by a century and counting. And here's something else the history books don't always give you: the food. The smell of Harlem at dinner time is its own kind of music. You catch it blocks away, and it follows you through every street and every stairwell and every open window, like a warm hand pulling you forward. The women who cook in Harlem have carried recipes north from every corner of the South, from the low country of South Carolina, where rice is a religion and shrimp is an art form, from the Mississippi Delta, where catfish fry in cast iron and cornbread crumbles golden at the edges, from Virginia, where ham is slow cured and collard greens simmer with pork until they're soft enough to argue with your soul. These recipes are not just food. They're memory, they're ancestry. They're the taste of grandmothers who survived things that should have been unsurvivable, encoded in the ratio of salt to fat, in the precise moment you pull the biscuits from the oven, in the way you season the beans with whatever you have. Because making something delicious out of almost nothing is a skill that slavery taught, and freedom hasn't made less necessary. On Lenox Avenue and 7th Avenue and the cross streets between, little restaurants and lunch counters serve what will eventually be called soul food, though in 1926 nobody calls it that yet. They just call it dinner. Fried chicken with a crust so crisp it shatters when you bite it. Smothered pork chops in brown gravy, thick enough to hold a spoon upright. Macaroni and cheese baked until the top is golden and the inside is a riot of cream and sharp cheddar. Sweet potato pie with nutmeg and cinnamon, and a filling so smooth it feels like velvet on your tongue. Collard greens, slow cooked with a ham hock until the pot liquor is dark and rich and worth drinking, on its own, which people do, because in this neighborhood, nothing goes to waste. Black-eyed peas and rice, what they call Hoppin' John down south, a dish with roots stretching back to West Africa through the rice plantations of coastal Georgia and South Carolina. Cornbread in every variation, sweet or savory, in a skillet or in a pan, crispy at the edges and tender in the middle. Always warm, always present, always the anchor of the table. The speakeasies serve food too, because you can't sell bootleg gin to people who haven't eaten and expect good outcomes. Late at night, after the bands have played their last set and the dancers have danced their last dance, the musicians and the performers and the hangers-on need somewhere to go, and the answer, increasingly, is the all-night supper clubs. The food at these places is legendary. Fried chicken and waffles, a combination so perfect it seems like it should have existed since the beginning of time, becomes a signature dish of Harlem's after-hours scene. You sit in a booth at 3 a.m. with a plate of crispy chicken and a stack of waffles with butter melting into the squares, and a jazz musician at the next table is arguing about tempo with his trombonist, and a woman in a beaded dress is laughing so hard she's holding onto the edge of the table. And you think, this is what freedom tastes like. Not grand freedom, not the freedom of proclamations and amendments, but the small, daily, irreplaceable freedom of being in a room full of your own people, eating food that your grandmother would recognize, listening to music that speaks your language, and not having to explain yourself to anyone. Saturday night on Lenox Avenue deserves its own paragraph, because Saturday night in Harlem is when the neighborhood fully exhales. The factories and the laundries and the kitchens where people work all week have released their grip, and the sidewalks fill with a current of humanity that moves with a rhythm you can almost dance to. Couples walk arm in arm. Groups of young men lean against storefronts, hats tilted, conversation fast and layered. Women in heels click past on their way to somewhere better. The clubs are filling up. The rent parties are warming up. The churches are dark and quiet, gathering their strength for Sunday morning. And the restaurants and food carts and basement kitchens are doing the Lord's work. Because a Saturday night in Harlem runs on food as much as it runs on music. You can eat your way from 125th Street to 145th Street and never taste the same dish twice. And every bite tells you something about where people came from and what they carried with them when they came. The street vendors add another layer to the symphony of smell. Push carts selling roasted sweet potatoes in winter their skins blackened and split, the orange flesh inside steaming in the cold air. Carts selling peanuts, roasted, and still warm in their shells. In summer, watermelon men calling out their wares and snow cone vendors with bottles of bright syrup lined up like a rainbow. The fruit stands on 125th Street, where you can buy apples and oranges and the occasional tropical fruit that's made its way up from the Caribbean along the same migration routes as the people. The economics of food in Harlem are complicated. People are poor, and the good food, the real food, the food with love in it, tends to come from home kitchens and rent party tables, rather than restaurants that most residents can't regularly afford. But the culture of food, the importance of gathering around a table, the understanding that cooking for someone is an act of love and eating together is an act of community, that culture is as central to the Harlem Renaissance as any poem or painting, even if nobody writes it down in an anthology. Let's talk about fashion for a moment, because you cannot walk through 1920s Harlem without noticing the clothes. The people here dress like they mean it. Sunday best is an understatement. Sunday best implies that you only bring your finest game once a week. In Harlem, people dress with intention every single day, because clothing in a community that has been stripped of so much is not vanity. It's armor, it's statement. It's the visible, undeniable insistence that you are somebody. The women are stunning. Drop-waisted dresses in silk and crepe, hemlines rising toward the knee in a direct challenge to everything their mothers were told about modesty. Cloche hats pulled low over bobbed hair, long strands of pearl beads that swing when they walk, feather boas draped over bare shoulders at evening events, fur coats, some real, some not, all carried with the same confidence. The flapper style that white America associates with gin and jazz and reckless youth takes on a different meaning in Harlem. Here, the short skirts and the bold makeup and the cigarette holders aren't just about modern rebellion. They're about black women claiming their bodies as their own in a country that has treated black women's bodies as property, as labor, as objects of exploitation for centuries. When a young black woman in 1926 puts on a silk dress and a string of pearls and steps out onto Lenox Avenue, she's doing more than going to a party. She's telling the world that she deserves beauty, that she deserves pleasure, that she deserves to be seen and admired on her own terms. The men are no less deliberate. Suits are essential, and the cut matters. In the mid-1920s, the look is sharp and tailored. High-waisted trousers with a crease that could cut paper, double-breasted jackets in wool or gabardine, wide-brimmed hats tilted at an angle that communicates more personality than a paragraph of prose. The zoot suit is coming. Those magnificent, extravagant creations with the wide legs and the long coats and the padded shoulders that will become a symbol of black cool in the 1930s and 1940s. But even before the zoot suit arrives, the men of Harlem understand that how you present yourself to the world matters. Colored socks, white gloves for formal occasions, velvet-collared Chesterfield coats that make a stroll down the avenue look like a scene from a movie that hasn't been filmed yet. The barbershops do a brisk business not just in haircuts but in grooming, in the careful cultivation of an appearance that says, I may work a job that doesn't pay me what I'm worth. I may live in an apartment that's falling apart. I may face indignities every single day that would break a lesser spirit. But when I step outside this door, I look like a king, and nobody can take that from me. Josephine Baker captures something about Harlem fashion and black self-presentation that travels all the way to Paris and takes the entire continent by storm. Before she leaves for France, she's performing in Harlem clubs and on Broadway, and she's already a fashion icon. Her gowns from the couturier Jean Patou, making the pages of Vogue magazine. There's something significant about a black woman from the slums of St. Louis, becoming a fashion trendsetter for both black and white women in Paris and New York. It says that black style, born out of necessity and refined through creativity, is not a derivative of white fashion. It's a force of its own, a creative tradition with its own logic and its own beauty, and the world is starting to notice. And then there's the photography. James Van Der Zee's studio on Lenox Avenue is where Harlem goes to see itself as it wants to be seen. Van Der Zee doesn't just take pictures. He creates portraits. He uses painted backdrops and careful lighting, and sometimes double exposures to create images that are part documentary and part aspiration. A couple on their wedding day, posed in front of a backdrop of classical columns, their expressions serene and confident and perfectly in love. A woman in a fur stole and a cloche hat, her gaze direct and unafraid, her posture saying everything about who she is and what she's worth. A family arranged in their best clothes, the children serious and still and adorable, the parents radiating the quiet satisfaction of people who have built something worth photographing. These images matter because they counter, one frame at a time, the relentless visual dehumanization that black Americans face everywhere else. In the movies, black faces are caricatures. In the newspapers, black faces appear mostly in crime stories. In advertising, black faces are mammy figures and Pickaninny cartoons. But in Van Der Zee's studio, black faces are beautiful, dignified, individual, and real. Every photograph is a small revolution. Every photograph says, this is what we look like when we're allowed to look like ourselves. Let's go back to the music for a moment, because we haven't talked about the blues yet, and you can't talk about what's revolutionary for the soul without talking about the blues. The blues arrives in Harlem the same way everything arrives in Harlem, carried north by the Great Migration in the hearts and the vocal cords and the guitar calluses of people who left the South but brought the South's music with them. The blues is older than jazz. It's rawer. It's more personal. If jazz is the sound of a community finding its collective voice, the blues is the sound of an individual soul reckoning with what life has done to it. And the reckoning isn't always pretty, but it's always honest. Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues, records for Columbia Records and sells millions of copies. Her voice is enormous, not just in volume but in emotional range. She can break your heart with a single held note and then rebuild it with the next phrase. She sings about love and loss and betrayal and poverty and the specific sadness of being a black woman in America when America doesn't particularly care whether you live or die. And she sings it with such power and such raw truth that the pain transforms into something else, something that feels almost like triumph, because the act of naming your suffering, the act of making it beautiful, the act of singing it in front of people who recognize their own suffering in your voice, that act is a kind of victory over the suffering itself. The blues doesn't fix anything. It doesn't solve anything. What it does is acknowledge the full weight of human experience without flinching. And in a world that expects black people to perform happiness and gratitude and simplicity, that unflinching honesty is its own form of rebellion. Ethel Waters crosses between blues and jazz and Broadway and eventually Hollywood, her career tracing the expanding territory that black performers are claiming in American cultural life. Alberta Hunter sings with such sophistication and emotional intelligence that European audiences regard her as one of the finest interpreters of popular song on either side of the Atlantic. And in the churches, in those 140 houses of worship that Ira Reid counts in 150 blocks, the music is taking a different form that will eventually be called gospel. Thomas A. Dorsey, who starts his career playing barrel house blues, begins writing songs that blend the emotional directness of the blues with the spiritual content of the church. And the result is a new genre, gospel music, that will become one of the most powerful and enduring forms of black musical expression. The church choirs of Harlem don't just perform these songs, they embody them. The call and response, the rhythmic clapping, the shouts and the moans, and the full body engagement of a congregation that is simultaneously worshipping God and processing the accumulated grief and joy of a people's entire history. This is music that does spiritual work. It heals. It sustains. It reminds people who they are and whose they are. And it's happening every Sunday in every church in Harlem. And it's as much a part of the Renaissance as anything happening in the Cotton Club or the Savoy. Now, there's another gathering place we haven't visited yet, and it sits at the intersection of everything the Renaissance represents. The 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library. During the day, it functions as a community resource, a place where working people can come to read and study and access information that might otherwise be out of reach. But in the evenings and on weekends, it becomes something more. The librarian, Ernestine Rose, and later her successor, the Martinican bibliophile Regina Andrews, turned the library into a literary salon, a meeting point for writers and thinkers and community members. Readings happen here. Exhibitions happen here. The Harlem Experimental Theatre performs here. And the collection grows, especially after Schomburg's materials arrive in 1926, into one of the most significant repositories of black history and culture in the world. Think about what it means for that collection to exist in a public library, free and open to anyone. Think about a young black person, maybe 16, maybe 17, who walks in off the street and finds on these shelves evidence of Egyptian civilizations and West African empires and Caribbean revolutions and Black American achievements stretching back centuries. Think about what that does to a mind that has been systematically starved of its own history. The American education system in 1926 teaches black children almost nothing about themselves, or worse, teaches them that their ancestors contributed nothing to human civilization. The Schomburg collection is a direct, physical, tangible rebuttal to that lie. You can hold the evidence in your hands. You can turn the pages. You can see the proof that your people have a history as rich and as complex and as worthy of study as any other people's history. And that knowledge, that simple, devastating knowledge, changes everything. It changes how you walk. It changes how you speak. It changes how you think about yourself and your possibilities. That's revolutionary for the soul. That's the whole point. And this brings us to one of the most important things about the Harlem Renaissance that often gets lost in the celebration of individual artists and their works. The Renaissance isn't just about the famous people. It's about what happens to a community when creativity becomes a shared value, when the assumption that art matters permeates daily life, when the bus driver and the teacher and the janitor and the seamstress all participate in the same cultural conversation as the poet and the painter and the musician. Harlem in the 1920s is a place where culture isn't something you consume. It's something you make. It's something you live. The grandmother who hums a spiritual while she does the ironing is an artist. The man who tells a story on the corner with timing so perfect the crowd can't breathe is an artist. The The child who draws pictures on the sidewalk with chalk is an artist. The Renaissance teaches a community that its own voice is worth hearing, and that lesson, once learned, can never be fully unlearned, no matter how many depressions come, no matter how many riots flare, no matter how many decades pass. The voice persists, the song continues, the soul, having been awakened, refuses to go back to sleep. Let's not forget the theatre, because the stage is where some of the most visible and most contested battles of the Renaissance play out. Before Harlem, black performers on the American stage are largely confined to minstrel shows and vaudeville acts that require them to perform stereotypes for white amusement. The shuffling, eye-rolling, exaggerated dialect of minstrelsy isn't just entertainment. It's a cage built of laughter, a way of allowing black people on stage only if they agree to be ridiculous. The Harlem Renaissance breaks that cage open. Shuffle Along lands on Broadway in 1921, and the impact is seismic. Written, composed, directed, and performed entirely by black artists, including U.B. Blake and Noble Sissle, the show runs for 504 performances and 3 national tours, proving definitively and profitably that white and black audiences will pay to see black performers doing work that isn't degrading. Langston Hughes later credits Shuffle Along as the moment the Renaissance truly begins, the pre-Charleston kick that launches the whole movement. The show gives Josephine Baker her first significant stage exposure. It generates a demand for more black shows on Broadway, more black performers in leading roles, more black stories told by the people who actually lived them. That demand doesn't always get met, and when it does, it's often on terms set by white producers and white audiences. But the door that Shuffle Along opens never fully closes. The Lafayette Theatre on 7th Avenue near 132nd Street becomes Harlem's theatrical home. Under new management starting in 1923, the Lafayette transforms into a lively community night spot. The Friday night late shows, running from midnight until 4 in the morning, become a hallowed neighborhood tradition. Professional performers share the stage with audience members brave enough to get up and deliver impromptu performances, and the line between performer and audience blurs in a way that's characteristically Harlem, because in this neighborhood, the audience is never truly passive. They talk back, they shout encouragement, they boo when something doesn't work. They are participants in the creation of art, not just consumers of it. The Little Theatre movement, with groups like the Krigwa Players, founded by Du Bois, and the Harlem Experimental Theatre at the 135th Street Library, pushes black drama in more serious and more experimental directions. These groups produce plays by black playwrights about black subjects, performed for black audiences in black spaces, and the work doesn't have to cater to white expectations or explain itself to white viewers. It can be complex, ambiguous, challenging, uncomfortable, beautiful. It can explore the internal contradictions of black life, colorism and class conflict, and generational tension, and the specific loneliness of being an educated black person in a world that doesn't believe educated black people exist, without worrying about whether the depiction will embarrass the race or confirm white stereotypes. The freedom to make imperfect art, to fail, to experiment, to be messy and honest rather than polished and representative. That freedom is itself revolutionary. It says, our stories are complex enough to require complex art, and we trust our audience to handle the complexity. At the Apollo Theatre on 125th Street, which opens in 1934 as the Renaissance is beginning to fade into its Depression-era twilight, the amateur night tradition will carry forward the participatory spirit of Harlem's theatrical culture for decades to come. But even before the Apollo, the theaters and performance spaces of Harlem serve a function that goes beyond entertainment. They're mirrors. They're stages in both senses of the word, platforms for performance and phases in a process of self-discovery. When a black audience watches a black performer tell a black story, something happens in the room that can't happen in any other context. A loop closes. A recognition occurs. The audience sees itself reflected on stage, not as a stereotype or a problem or a curiosity, but as a full, complicated human reality. And that reflection, that moment of seeing yourself seen, is one of the most powerful experiences a person can have. Think about the cumulative effect of all of this. The music, the literature, the visual arts, the theatre, the fashion, the food, the churches, the barbershops, the beauty parlours, the street corner debates, the rent parties, the library readings, the little magazines and the big manifestos, the photographs and the paintings and the sculptures and the dances. All of it happening simultaneously. All of it happening within walking distance. All of it feeding into and feeding off of everything else. A poet hears a jazz solo and writes a poem that captures the feeling of improvisation. A painter sees the poem and creates an image that captures the visual rhythm of the language. A dancer sees the painting and invents a movement that embodies the image. A musician sees the dancer and composes a piece that responds to the movement. The creative energy is circular and self-reinforcing, and it accelerates with every revolution. And the result is a cultural moment so dense and so rich that scholars will still be unpacking it 100 years later and finding new layers they hadn't noticed before. And all of it, every bit of it, is happening in a community that the rest of America either ignores, exploits, or actively tries to destroy. That's the part that gives the Renaissance its particular intensity, its urgency, its emotional depth. These aren't artists creating from comfort. These are artists creating from necessity. The poems aren't luxury items. They're lifelines. The music isn't background noise. It's the sound of survival being turned into something beautiful. The paintings aren't decorations. They're evidence of humanity that the rest of the world refuses to acknowledge. When Langston Hughes writes, "I too sing America," he's not making a polite request for inclusion. He's stating a fact that the country has spent 3 centuries trying to deny, and the fact that he can state it, and that a community of readers and listeners and thinkers and dreamers can receive it and recognize it and be changed by it. That's the revolution. That's what's revolutionary for the soul. The soul, after all, is not a metaphor in the Black American tradition. It's a real thing, as real as bone, as real as the music that comes out of a trumpet at 2 a.m, as real as the tears that come unbidden when you hear a spiritual sung the way your grandmother sang it. The soul is the part of you that survives everything that's done to your body. The soul is the part of the community that survives everything that's done to its members. The soul is what carries the melody from West Africa across the Middle Passage, through 250 years of slavery, through Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the Great Migration, to a tenement apartment in Harlem, where a young man sits at a piano and plays something that makes the whole building lean closer. The Harlem Renaissance doesn't create the black soul. The black soul creates the Harlem Renaissance. And what happens in those 3 square miles, in those brief and blazing years, is the soul finally getting the room it needs to stretch out and breathe and sing at full volume. And the sound of that singing changes everything. Here's where we need to talk about what all this music means, because it's not just entertainment. Music in the black community has never been just entertainment. spirituals kept the soul alive during slavery. Work songs paced the labor and carried coded messages of resistance. The blues gave language to private suffering. And jazz, the thing being born in these Harlem clubs and dance halls and rent parties, jazz is something else entirely. Jazz is the sound of freedom practiced. Improvisation, the core principle of jazz, isn't just a musical technique, it's a philosophy. It says, the rules are a starting point, not a destination. It says, the individual voice matters within the collective, and the collective supports the individual voice. It says, beauty can emerge from chaos if everyone in the room is listening to each other. In a country that denies black people the most basic freedoms, jazz is a space where freedom is not just discussed, but enacted, not just dreamed about, but made real in real time, in front of a live audience every single night. That's why the Harlem Renaissance is revolutionary for the soul. Not just because of what gets created, though what gets created is staggering, but because of what the creation means. For the first time, in concentrated and visible and undeniable form, Black Americans are proving to themselves and to the world that their experience is not a footnote to the American story. It is the American story, or at least the most important chapter in it. The chapter about what it means to be human under pressure, to create beauty out of injustice, to insist on joy in the face of systematic cruelty. Let's go deeper into the literary scene, because the writers of the Harlem Renaissance aren't just producing excellent work. They're having arguments that matter. Arguments about the purpose of art and the meaning of blackness, and the relationship between beauty and politics that are still relevant today. The great debate of the Renaissance, the one that runs through every dinner party and every editorial and every late-night conversation in every apartment on Sugar Hill, is this. What is black art for? W. E. B. Du Bois, the towering intellectual, the editor of The Crisis, the man who in 1903 published The Souls of Black Folk and essentially invented the modern discourse about race in America. Du Bois believes that black art should serve the cause of racial uplift. Art should present the best of black life. It should demonstrate black capability. It should prove to white America that black people are worthy of full citizenship. Art is, in Du Bois's framing, a form of propaganda, and he uses that word without apology. All art is propaganda, he writes, and I do not care a damn for any art that is not used for propaganda. On the other side of this argument stands Langston Hughes, who in 1926 publishes an essay called The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain that functions as a kind of counter-manifesto. Hughes argues that the black artist's obligation is not to uplift or to prove anything to anyone. The obligation is to tell the truth about black life in all its complexity, its beauty and its ugliness, its sophistication and its roughness, its church hats and its juke joints. If white people are pleased, we are glad, Hughes writes. If they are not, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful, and ugly too. That last sentence is the whole philosophy. It's a declaration of artistic independence that says, we will define ourselves. We will include the parts that make respectable people uncomfortable. We will not sand down our edges to make white audiences feel safe or to make the race look good. We will be whole. Between these two positions, a dozen other artists stake out their own ground. Alain Locke, the philosopher, argues for a sophisticated black aesthetics that draws on African art traditions and creates something distinctly modern. Claude McKay writes with a political fury that makes both Du Bois and Hughes look moderate. Zora Neale Hurston insists on the folk tradition, the rural Black South, the voices of ordinary people, and she doesn't care if the intellectuals in Harlem think she's being provincial. Wallace Thurman, brilliant and self-destructive and unflinchingly honest, writes a novel called The Blacker the Berry that confronts colorism within the black community, the hierarchy of skin tone that places lighter-skinned people above darker-skinned people. And nobody's comfortable, and that's exactly the point. Nella Larson writes Quicksand and Passing, novels that explore the psychological complexity of mixed-race identity and the performance of racial belonging. And they're so sophisticated in their treatment of interiority that critics will need another 50 years to fully appreciate them. These debates matter because they're not just about aesthetics. They're about identity. They're about who gets to decide what blackness means. For 300 years, that decision had been made by white people, slaveholders who defined blackness as property, scientists who defined blackness as biological inferiority, lawmakers who defined blackness as legal, disability, entertainers who defined blackness as minstrelsy, and now, in these few square miles of Upper Manhattan, black artists are wresting that power away from all of them and arguing among themselves about what to do with it. The arguments are passionate and sometimes bitter and occasionally personal, and they never fully resolve, and that's fine, because the point isn't the resolution. The point is the argument itself. The point is that black people are having a public, sophisticated, passionate conversation about the meaning and purpose of their own culture, in their own spaces, on their own terms. And that conversation is, in itself, an act of revolution. Let's shift to the visual arts, because the soul needs images as much as it needs words and music. Aaron Douglas is the visual architect of the Harlem Renaissance, the man who creates the movement's signature look. His style combines Art Deco geometry with silhouettes drawn from African sculpture, and the result is something nobody has seen before. Black figures rendered in bold, stylized forms, their bodies elongated, their gestures sweeping, surrounded by concentric circles of light and shadow that suggest both the spiritual and the cosmic. Douglas illustrates the covers of the Crisis and Opportunity magazines. He creates murals for public buildings. His work appears in Alain Locke's The New Negro Anthology. And every time a black reader picks up a magazine and sees a Douglas illustration on the cover, they see themselves depicted not as a caricature, not as a sociological subject, but as a figure of beauty and power and dignity. That matters more than any art critic can measure. Augusta Savage is sculpting in a tiny studio in Harlem, making portraits of ordinary people with such tenderness and precision that the work transcends its modest scale. Her sculpture, Garmin, a portrait of a Harlem street kid, captures something essential about black childhood. The mix of vulnerability and toughness, the watchfulness, the hint of humor. Savage can't afford bronze, so she works in plaster, and the plaster doesn't always survive. And some of her best work is lost because the materials of poverty are not the materials of permanence. But she does something arguably more important than any individual sculpture. She teaches. She opens her studio to neighborhood children who have no access to art education, no museums that welcome them, no schools that think they're worth teaching. She gives them clay and she gives them her time, and she gives them the radical idea that their hands can make something beautiful. And some of those children grow up to become the next generation of black artists. And the chain continues, and the revolution propagates itself through the simple, miraculous act of a woman who refuses to let talent go to waste, because the world has decided that black children don't deserve art supplies. James Van Der Zee is behind the camera, and his photographs do for visual self-image what Hughes's poems do for literary self-image. Van der Zee photographs Harlem's residents the way they want to be seen. His studio portraits present black men and women in their finest clothes, their most carefully considered poses, their most dignified and self-possessed expressions. He photographs weddings and funerals and family gatherings and church events and street parades and the interiors of people's homes. He photographs Marcus Garvey's Unia parades, thousands of black people marching in formation wearing elaborate uniforms, the visual embodiment of a community that has decided to take itself seriously. Every photograph is an act of counter-narrative. In an America where the dominant images of black people are caricatures and mugshots and sociological case studies, Van der Zee says, "Look at these people. Look at how they carry themselves. Look at the love in this wedding portrait. Look at the pride in this family photograph. This is who we are, not what you've been told. What we're showing you, right now, with our own faces." Now let's talk about the women, because if you tell the story of the Harlem Renaissance without centering the women, you're telling less than half the story, and the half you're telling doesn't make sense without the other half. Start with Alelia Walker, the daughter of Madam C.J. Walker, America's first self-made female millionaire, who built her fortune through a line of hair care products designed for black women, and who understood, decades before anyone used the phrase, that economic empowerment and cultural pride are the same project. Alelia inherits her mother's fortune and her mother's instinct for bringing people together. Her townhouse on West 136th Street, a double-wide brownstone designed by black architect Vertner Tandy, becomes one of the most important gathering places of the Renaissance. The rooms have gold-colored walls and velvet furnishings, and a sky-blue Victrola, and a rose-colored piano and napkins embroidered with the name of the salon she establishes on the upper floors. The Dark Tower, named after a County Cullen poem. Hughes later writes that her parties are as crowded as the New York subway at rush hour. She issues several hundred invitations for a space that holds 100, and unless you arrive early, getting in is hopeless. But what makes the Dark Tower extraordinary isn't the guest list, though the guest list includes Hughes and Hurston and Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson and Alberta Hunter and dozens of others. What makes it extraordinary is what it represents. A black woman in a space she owns, creating a gathering place where artists and intellectuals and activists and performers can meet as equals, can argue and collaborate and flirt and drink bootleg champagne and eat caviar and inspire each other, can exist in a world where their talent is the only price of admission and nothing else matters. In a country that segregates every public space, the Dark Tower is a private revolution. Alelia herself is a presence that nobody forgets. Hughes calls her the joy goddess of Harlem's 1920s, and the description is both affectionate and precise. She's tall, she's striking, she wears haute couture like armor, and she moves through her own parties with the confidence of someone who knows that the room exists because she willed it into being. She's not a writer or a painter or a musician herself. She's something arguably more important. She's a patron, a connector, a host whose genius is creating the conditions in which other people's genius can flourish. Jesse Redmond Fawcett, the literary editor of The Crisis from 1919 to 1926, publishes more young black writers during this period than any other single person in America. Langston Hughes credits her as one of the people who midwifed the entire literary renaissance into existence. She's a novelist herself, but her most lasting contribution might be her editorial eye, her ability to recognize talent before anyone else sees it, and her willingness to put the full weight of the Crisis's readership behind unknown writers who have something important to say. Georgia Douglas Johnson holds literary gatherings at her home in Washington, D.C. that function as a southern outpost of the Renaissance, nurturing writers who can't always make it to Harlem. Ethel Waters, who earns roughly $1,000 a week at her peak, when household workers make $5 to $10, becomes one of the first black women to star in otherwise white casts on Broadway. Josephine Baker leaves America entirely, goes to Paris, and becomes the most famous entertainer in Europe, which is both a triumph and an indictment, the implication being that a black woman has to leave her own country to be treated as a full human being. And beneath the famous names, supporting the entire structure, are the thousands of unnamed women who make the Renaissance possible through their daily labor. The domestic workers who clean white people's houses downtown and come home to Harlem in the evening, and go to rent parties on Saturday night and church on Sunday morning, and somehow find time to attend a poetry reading at the 135th Street Library on Tuesday. The laundresses who carry the Renaissance in their hearts, who go to the readings and the dances and the debates, and who believe, even when they can't quite articulate it, that something extraordinary is happening around them and that they are part of it. The grandmothers who cook the food that fuels the parties, the church mothers who sing the spirituals that keep the soul intact. The movement doesn't happen without them. It can't. Let's talk about what's happening at 103 West 135th Street, because that address is quietly one of the most important locations in the entire Renaissance. It's the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library, and in 1925, it acquires the personal collection of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, a Puerto Rican man of African descent who has spent his entire adult life collecting books, manuscripts, artwork, and artifacts documenting the history and culture of people of African descent around the world. The collection contains thousands of items. It becomes the nucleus of what will eventually become the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, one of the most important research institutions in the world. And it starts right here, in a neighborhood library, because a man who was told as a child that black people had no history set out to prove that statement wrong, and spent his life building the evidence. The library itself becomes a gathering place. Readings, lectures, exhibitions, and discussions happen here regularly. It's open to anyone. It's free. It's a space where a young person from a sharecropping family can walk in off the street and encounter, for the first time, the documented proof that their people have a history that stretches back thousands of years across continents through civilizations, and that this history includes empires and universities and scientific discoveries and artistic masterpieces and philosophical traditions. If you want to understand why the Renaissance is revolutionary for the soul, think about what it means for a young black person in 1926 to walk into that library and discover that they come from somewhere, that the lie they've been told, the lie that black people are a people without history, without culture, without contribution, is not just wrong, but spectacularly, provably wrong. That's not just education, that's liberation. And it's happening on every level, in every space, every day. The school teacher who assigns Langston Hughes in her classroom and watches a student's face change as the words land. The preacher who quotes Du Bois from the pulpit on a Sunday morning and sees the congregation lean forward as one body. The barber who has a copy of The Crisis on his shelf next to the hair tonic and the pomade, and who will debate you about its contents while he sharpens his razor on a leather strop. The grandmother who tells her granddaughter with a firmness that leaves no room for negotiation, stand up straight, look people in the eye, speak clearly, and never, not once, not ever, let anyone tell you what you're worth. These are the small, daily acts of cultural revolution that don't make the history books, but that make the history books possible. The Harlem Renaissance isn't just what happens in the Cotton Club and the Dark Tower and the pages of literary magazines. It's what happens in the ordinary lives of ordinary people who are surrounded by extraordinary energy and who absorb it and pass it on. Let's walk down to 7th Avenue and talk about the parades, because Harlem loves a parade. Fraternal orders like the Prince Hall Masons and the Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks have set up lodges here with elaborate buildings, auditoriums, and big brass bands. On public holidays, lodge anniversaries, church celebrations, and funerals, the members put on their uniforms and march down the avenue with full musical accompaniment, and the neighborhood turns out to watch. The parade's a spectacle, community, and assertion all at once. Black people dressed in regalia, marching in formation, accompanied by music, claiming the public space of the street as their own. Marcus Garvey's Unia parades are the grandest of all. Thousands of people in military-style uniforms, Black Star Line nurses in white, the African Legion in dark blue, Garvey himself riding in an open car wearing a plumed admiral's hat. And whatever you think of his politics, and people in Harlem think a lot of things about his politics, the sight of all those black people marching together with pride and purpose is something that stays with you. It remakes your sense of what's possible. It tells you that you are not alone, and that you are part of something bigger than yourself, and that the something bigger is beautiful. Let's bring it back to the intimate. It's late now, well past midnight. The big clubs are reaching their peak, but you're somewhere quieter. Maybe you're in someone's apartment on West 136th Street, sitting on a radiator because all the chairs are taken. There are maybe 20 people here, maybe 30, squeezed into a parlor that was designed for 6. Someone is reading a poem. The room is quiet in that specific way that a room gets quiet when something real is happening. The poet is young, maybe 22, maybe 25, and the poem is about their mother, or their grandmother, or the train ride north, or the feeling of standing on Lenox Avenue at dusk when the city turns golden and the music starts, and you suddenly feel, for the first time in your life, that you belong somewhere. The poem ends, and there's a beat of silence, and then someone says yes, and someone else says, read another one, and someone in the kitchen pours another drink, and the night continues. This fragile, beautiful gathering of people who are making culture not because anyone is paying them to do it, but because the making of culture is as necessary as breathing. This is what the Renaissance looks like up close. Not the grand narrative of movements and manifestos, but the small human moments. A woman hearing her own dialect in a published poem for the first time. A man seeing a painting of a black face that isn't a caricature and feeling something shift in his chest. A child picking up a lump of clay in Augusta Savage's studio and discovering that their hands can make something beautiful. A couple on the dance floor at the Savoy, moving together in a way that feels like flight, and for 3 minutes, just 3 minutes, forgetting every reason the world has given them to be afraid. These moments don't look like revolution. They look like ordinary life, but that's the point. The revolution of the Harlem Renaissance is the insistence that black ordinary life is extraordinary, that black joy is political, that black beauty is real, and that the soul of a people who've been told for 300 years that they don't have one is in fact the most vibrant and creative and resilient soul in the history of the Americas. Let's talk about the economics underneath all of this, because art doesn't happen in a vacuum, and neither does revolution. The Harlem Renaissance runs on money, and the money is complicated. Some of it comes from within the community. The numbers game, Harlem's unofficial lottery, generates an enormous underground economy. Policy bankers, the men and women who run the numbers rackets, become de facto community financiers, lending money to businesses, sponsoring events, and providing a financial safety net that the legitimate banking system refuses to offer black customers. It's not legal, and it's not always pretty, but it works, and in a community that's been systematically excluded from conventional economic institutions, the numbers game is as much a survival strategy as it is a vice. Some of the money comes from black businesses that serve the community directly. Beauty parlors and barbershops generate steady income. Madam C.J. Walker's hair care empire, continued after her death by her daughter Alelia, is the most prominent example, but there are smaller entrepreneurs everywhere. People who open restaurants and boarding houses and tailoring shops and funeral homes and corner stores, each one a small act of economic self-determination in a system designed to prevent exactly that. The black newspapers generate advertising revenue and subscription income. The churches collect tithes that fund not just worship but social services, education, and community development. The YMCA on 135th Street and the YWCA on 137th Street serve as community centers, offering athletics, classes, meeting spaces, and social networks that supplement and sometimes replace services the city government fails to provide. But some of the money comes from white patrons, and this is where the economics get genuinely complicated. Charlotte Osgood Mason, a wealthy white woman who fancies herself a patron of primitive art, provides financial support to several key Renaissance figures, including Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. She insists on being called godmother. She has very specific ideas about what kind of art her black protégé should create, ideas rooted in essentialist notions about black people being closer to nature, more instinctual, more spiritually authentic than white people. The money comes with strings, and the strings feel suspiciously like puppet strings, and eventually both Hughes and Hurston will break with Mason, but not before the relationship has produced real work and real resentment, and a real object lesson in the dangers of financial dependence on people who think they own your creativity because they're paying your rent. Carl Van Vechten, a white novelist, photographer, and professional provocateur, is another complicated figure. He's genuinely passionate about black culture. He opens doors in the white publishing world for several Renaissance writers, and he throws integrated parties at his downtown apartment where black and white artists mingle in ways that are rare for the era. But he also writes a novel called Nigger Heaven, published in 1926, and the title alone tells you something about the limits of white allyship in the 1920s. The novel is intended as a sympathetic portrait of Harlem life, and some Renaissance figures defend it, and some are furious, and the debate that follows is really a debate about who has the right to tell black stories and on what terms. It's a debate that will continue for the next century and beyond, because it touches on something fundamental about the relationship between power and representation, between who has the money and who has the experience, between who publishes the books and whose life is in the pages. The publishing pipeline itself is mostly white-controlled. Black writers in the 1920s have limited options for getting their work in front of readers. The Crisis and Opportunity provide crucial platforms, but they're magazines, not book publishers. To publish a novel or a poetry collection, you generally need a white publisher, which means you need a white editor who believes your work is worth publishing, which means you need access to the social and professional networks where those decisions are made. This is where figures like Jessie Fauset and Charles Johnson become so important. They use their editorial positions to connect black writers with white publishers, to curate literary contests that bring new voices to national attention, and to build a bridge between the creative explosion happening in Harlem and the publishing infrastructure that can amplify it to a wider audience. The opportunity literary contests of the mid-1920s launch careers. The awards dinners bring black writers into the same room as white publishers and critics for the first time. It's not a perfect system. It's dependent on white gatekeepers and subject to white tastes. But it works well enough to produce a body of literature that will endure long after the gatekeepers are forgotten. Here's something worth sitting with. The Harlem Renaissance produces its art under conditions that would destroy most creative movements before they start. The artists are underpaid. The community is exploited. The wider society is violently hostile. The financial infrastructure is fragile and often dependent on the goodwill of people who don't fully understand or respect the work they're supporting. And yet, the work endures. The poems are still read. The music is still played. The paintings still hang in museums. The novels are still taught in universities around the world. How is that possible? How does a community with so little produce so much? The answer, I think, is in the soul. Not soul as a metaphor. Soul as a literal, lived reality. The people of the Harlem Renaissance carry within them the accumulated spiritual weight of the entire Black American experience, from the Middle Passage to the cotton fields to the Great Migration. They carry the spirituals and the work songs and the folk tales and the recipes and the prayers and the lullabies and the jokes and the survival strategies that have been passed down through generations. Each generation adding its own layer, its own pain, its own beauty, its own refusal to be destroyed. And when those people arrive in Harlem and find themselves, for the first time, in a place where their numbers are large enough and their density is high enough and their freedom is just broad enough to allow for public, collective, organized creative expression, all of that accumulated soul pours out. It pours out in the form of poems and novels and plays. It pours out in the form of paintings and sculptures and photographs. It pours out most of all in the form of music, because music has always been the primary vehicle of black soul, the art form that requires no materials beyond the human body, no permission beyond the willingness to open your mouth and sing. The soul of the Harlem Renaissance is not invented in the 1920s. It's uncorked. It's been building for 300 years, in the holds of slave ships and the quarters of plantations and the pews of secret churches and the kitchens of sharecropper cabins, building pressure like something geological. And when it finally finds an outlet, the force of it is enough to reshape American culture permanently. That's why the Renaissance is revolutionary for the soul. Not because it creates something new out of nothing, because it releases something ancient and enormous and beautiful that has been waiting this whole time for a chance to be heard. Think about what it must have felt like. Think about being a 20-year-old black woman in 1926, freshly arrived from Alabama, standing on the corner of 135th and Lenox on a summer evening. Behind you, someone is playing a trumpet in an open window. Across the street, a knot of men are arguing about whether Marcus Garvey is a prophet or a con man. Next door, a beauty parlor is still open, and through the window you can see 3 women under dryers, their heads back, their eyes closed, resting. A boy runs past with a newspaper under his arm, shouting headlines. The smell of frying fish drifts from a basement apartment. A couple walks by in clothes so sharp they could be in a magazine, her arm through his, both of them moving with the kind of easy confidence that comes from being in a place where nobody is going to ask them to step aside or lower their eyes or explain what they're doing in this neighborhood. A church bell rings somewhere in the middle distance, faint and bronze-colored in the warm air, and you stand there, on that corner, with the trumpet behind you and the argument across the street, and the smell of fish frying and the click of heels on pavement, and you realize, maybe for the first time in your entire life, that you are surrounded by black people who are living, not just surviving, not just enduring, not just getting by, but living, fully and loudly and beautifully, and that the air itself seems to vibrate with something that you don't have a word for yet, but that feels unmistakably, undeniably, like possibility. That feeling, that specific, unrepeatable, once-in-a-lifetime feeling of a community discovering its own power, its own beauty, its own voice. That's the Harlem Renaissance, and it lives still in every note of jazz, in every line of poetry, in every act of creative defiance that says, I am here, I am beautiful, and I will not be silent. But we should talk about what the Renaissance is up against, because understanding the achievement requires understanding the obstacles. Harlem in the 1920s is not a paradise. It's a neighborhood under siege from economic exploitation, racial violence, and the daily indignities of life in a segregated America. White landlords charge premium rents for deteriorating apartments. White-owned businesses on 125th Street, the commercial heart of Harlem, refuse to hire black employees, which will eventually spark the don't buy where you can't work boycotts. The police presence in Harlem is both inadequate and hostile, meaning crime is under-policed and black residents are over-policed, and the contradiction is as American as apple pie. Tuberculosis rates in Harlem are among the highest in the city, a direct result of overcrowding and poverty. Infant mortality is devastating. The hospitals that serve the neighborhood are underfunded and understaffed. And beyond Harlem, the wider America of the 1920s is a terrifying place for black people. Lynching continues in the South. The Ku Klux Klan reaches its peak membership, roughly 4 million people, in the mid-1920s, and its influence extends far beyond the South, into Indiana and Oregon and Ohio, and everywhere else. Segregation is the law in southern states and the practice, if not the statute, in northern ones. The Red Summer of 1919, just a few years before the Renaissance hits its stride, saw racial massacres in dozens of American cities. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 destroyed Black Wall Street and killed hundreds of black residents. The message from white America is clear and consistent. Stay in your place, and if you don't, we will put you there by force. The Renaissance happens in spite of all this, or maybe because of all this. Maybe the concentrated energy of the Harlem Renaissance is, in part, a response to the concentrated violence and oppression that surrounds it. Maybe the insistence on beauty is a form of resistance against a world that insists on ugliness. Maybe the act of writing a poem, or painting a painting, or composing a symphony or dancing the Lindy Hop is, in this context, as radical as any protest march, because it says, you can terrorize us, you can exploit us, you can pass laws against us, you can burn our neighborhoods to the ground, but you cannot destroy our capacity for creation, our hunger for beauty, our determination to be fully, magnificently, unapologetically human. And that is the revolution. Not a political revolution, though politics are part of it. A revolution of the soul. A collective decision made by a community of artists and thinkers and workers and dreamers that the story they've been told about themselves is a lie, and that they will tell a different story, a true story, and that the telling itself will be the most beautiful thing America has ever produced. The Renaissance doesn't end with a bang. It fades slowly, the way music fades when the musicians are tired and the hour is late and the room has thinned out, but nobody wants to be the first to leave. The Great Depression arrives in 1929 and squeezes the economic life out of the community. Patrons dry up, magazines fold, the rent parties continue, but the mood darkens. A riot in 1935, sparked by a false rumor that police killed a shoplifter, damages stores along 125th Street and signals a shift in Harlem's relationship with the city and itself. Some of the artists scatter. Hughes keeps writing, and will keep writing for decades, becoming the most prolific and beloved black literary figure of the 20th century. Hurston heads south to collect folklore and write the novels that will secure her immortality. Du Bois turns increasingly toward Pan-Africanism and eventually leaves America altogether. Ellington keeps composing, becoming the greatest American composer period, no qualifier needed. The younger artists grow older and carry what they've learned into the Depression years and the war years and the Civil Rights years and beyond. But the soul of the thing, the feeling, the energy, the specific magic of being in Harlem in the 1920s, when everything was happening at once, that particular moment doesn't come again. It can't come again, because the conditions that produced it, the Great Migration, Prohibition, the post-war moment, the concentration of talent in those 3 square miles, the collision of all those forces, that's a once-in-history convergence. What survives, though, is what it proved. It proved that black culture, created by black people for black people on black people's terms, is not a subculture or a niche or a sociological curiosity. It's one of the most powerful creative forces in the history of human civilization. It proved that centuries of oppression cannot destroy the human capacity for beauty. It proved that a people who were stolen from their homeland, stripped of their languages, their religions, their names, their families, and forced into the most brutal system of labor the modern world has ever seen, that those people could, out of the wreckage, build a culture so rich and so deep and so influential that it would reshape the art, the music, the literature, and the soul of the entire world. That's what the Harlem Renaissance was. That's why it was revolutionary for the soul. Not just the black soul, though it was certainly that. The human soul, the reminder that beauty is not a luxury. It's a necessity. It's how we survive. It's how we prove to ourselves that we are more than what has been done to us. So tonight, as you lie here in the warmth and the quiet, think about those 3 square miles. Think about the saxophone player on the fire escape at 2 a.m, playing for nobody and everybody at once. Think about the rent party, where a 20-year-old piano player is inventing the future of American music between the kitchen table and the coal stove. Think about Langston Hughes at a desk in a cold apartment, writing a poem about a people who are tired and beautiful. Think about Augusta Savage, handing a lump of clay to a child who's never been told their hands can make something worth looking at. Think about the dancers at the Savoy, their feet moving faster than thought, their bodies speaking a language that doesn't need translation. Think about Alelia Walker standing in her own doorway, wearing a gown that costs more than most people's yearly rent, welcoming geniuses into a room that exists because she decided it should exist. Think about the unnamed grandmother in the church choir, her voice carrying a spiritual that has traveled from West Africa to South Carolina to Harlem. The melody unbroken, the faith unshaken, the beauty undeniable. Whisper a quiet thank you to every one of them, the poets who put your experience into language for the first time. the musicians who turned suffering and joy into a sound that made the whole planet move, the painters who showed you as you actually are, not as the world wanted you to be, the domestic workers and the elevator operators and the Pullman porters and the laundresses and the numbers runners and the church mothers and the barbers who carried the Renaissance in their daily lives, who went to the readings and the parties and the dances, and who believed, even when they couldn't quite name it, that something extraordinary was unfolding around them and that their presence was part of it. They didn't just create art. They created the possibility of art. They made a space where black creativity could breathe, and in breathing could change everything. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't just a movement. It was a declaration. We are here. We have always been here. We are brilliant and complicated and joyful and grieving and fierce and tender, and we will not be quiet. History doesn't always announce its most important moments with trumpets and banners. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing that ever happened was a young man reading a poem in a library while people sat on the floor to listen, their eyes closed, their hearts open. Sometimes it was a woman dancing in a ballroom until her feet hurt, and her heart was full, and the music carried her somewhere she'd never been, somewhere that felt, for the first time, like home. Sometimes it was a grandmother humming a spiritual while she pressed a shirt, passing down a melody that had traveled 3 continents and 4 centuries, unbroken, unsilenced, alive. Close your eyes now. Let the warmth of your bed hold you the way the music held those dancers. Let the quiet of this moment carry you the way those poems carried a people through their darkest and their brightest hours. And know that every time you hear a jazz riff or read a poem that makes you feel something you can't quite name, or see a painting that stops you in your tracks and makes the world look different than it did a moment ago, you're hearing an echo from Harlem, from those 3 square miles, from those extraordinary, ordinary people who decided that the world was going to listen, whether it wanted to or not. Sleep well tonight. Rest easily. And carry the Renaissance with you into your dreams, because their courage echoes still, in every song, in every brushstroke, in every defiant act of beauty. They sang so that you could listen. They danced so that you could rest. They wrote and painted and composed and argued and loved so that the world would never be the same. And it isn't. It never will be again. Good night.